What happened if something you never imagined but it happens? Hey friends! We're working our butts off to bring you this content, just for your entertainment. If you like what you see, here's a deal. Instead of offering us tea, just hit that subscribe button. It's way easier, totally free, and honestly makes us just as happy. Let's see in this story. I was raised to believe that identity was a single straight line. You chose who you were early, you proved it by consistency, and you earned respect by never confusing anyone, including yourself. In my family, being a man was mostly shorthand for being useful, being steady, and not asking for too much space. My father worked with his hands, and his patience ran thin when he thought people were indulging feelings. My mother carried the emotional weather of the house, and when she was tired she'd snap at anything that looked like weakness. I learned quickly what got praised. Finishing chores, staying quiet, doing well in school, handling things. As a kid I felt a constant low-grade worry that some part of me might be wrong. I didn't have language for it. It wasn't that I thought I was a girl, or that I had a secret plan to become someone else. It was more like I could sense the boundaries of what was allowed, and I kept bumping into them in small, private ways. At my aunt's house there was a box of old costume jewelry in a closet. Plastic pearls, a thin chain necklace, clip-on earrings. Once, when the adults were outside, I tried on the necklace in front of the mirror. I remember the strange calm that followed. My face didn't change. My body didn't change. But something in my mind unclenched, as if I'd been holding a breath I didn't know I was holding. Then the shame hit, fast and hot. I put it back and washed my hands as if the feeling were dirt. Later I heard my cousins joke about a boy at school who acted like a girl, and I filed the memory away like contraband. That was how it went for years. Small moments of curiosity followed by a larger wave of fear. I didn't tell anyone, not because I thought I was hiding a grand truth, but because the culture around me treated any deviation as evidence. If you liked the wrong thing, it meant something permanent. If you tried something, it meant you were that thing. And if you were that thing, you were at risk. So I became the version of myself that seemed safest. Played the right sports. I learned the right voice. I practiced being unbothered. In college I studied something practical, the kind of degree that would look good in a family photo. I dated women in a way that made sense on paper. I wasn't miserable, exactly. I laughed, I worked, I made friends. But there was always that feeling, an itch beneath the skin, a sense that my inner life had rooms I never entered. When I met Claire, I admired her in a way that felt clean and uncomplicated. She was ambitious without apology, the kind of person who made plans and then actually followed them. She spoke clearly, even when the truth wasn't flattering. If she was scared, she didn't disguise it as anger. She would name it and act anyway. I had spent years learning to disappear inside my own competence, and she did the opposite. She seemed to take up space as naturally as breathing. We built our life the way many couples do. Steps that looked like progress. An apartment, then a better apartment. A joint bank account. A small wedding that felt warm rather than showy. We both worked, we both contributed. I was proud to be dependable. She was proud to be excellent. Fit. And then, in my mid-30s, I lost my job. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no public firing. My company was restructuring, which is a polite way of saying the math had changed and certain people were now excess. I got a meeting with a manager who couldn't hold eye contact and a packet that explained severance in bullet points. I walked out carrying a cardboard box like a prop from someone else's story. For the first few days I treated it like a temporary problem, a puzzle that would be solved by effort. I updated my resume. I emailed contacts. I made lists. But as the weeks piled up, a different feeling crept in. Not just anxiety, but the sense of losing a role I'd been using to anchor my identity. Work had given me structure. It had given me a way to feel valuable without having to talk about feelings. It had given me a uniform, literal in the form of office clothes, and symbolic in the form of certainty. Claire watched me with that sharp, quiet attention she had when she was deciding how to respond rather than how to react. One evening, after I'd spent the day applying for positions that didn't quite fit, she sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "We can keep pretending this is a short detour, Or we can make a plan that doesn't depend on pretending. I bristled. Not at her, exactly. At the implication that I might need to change the story I'd been telling myself. She continued gently. My promotion track is real. I can take on more responsibility. If I push, I can become our primary income. But I need you to be with me in that. Not half with me and half mourning what you think you should be. There was a silence that felt like standing at the edge of a pool. I wanted to argue, to insist I'd be back on my feet soon, that she shouldn't have to carry us. But another part of me, the part that was exhausted from performing steadiness, felt a strange relief. I heard myself say, okay, what would that look like? She didn't celebrate or pity me. She opened a notebook. We talked about money, budgets, timelines. She asked what I wanted, not in an abstract sense but in a daily sense. What would I do with my time? What responsibilities would I own? The plan that formed was practical. She would lean into her career, and I would manage the home. Cooking, cleaning, bills, errands, appointments. If I found a job that made sense, great. But we wouldn't make our life hinge on that hunt alone. We would stabilize. The first morning after we agreed, Claire left the house in her work clothes. Sharp lines, confident posture. And I stood in the kitchen holding a sponge like it was a symbol of failure. I didn't feel noble. I didn't feel enlightened. Felt exposed. I worried about what it meant if the neighbors saw me taking out trash on a weekday, or if friends asked why I was free for lunch. I worried that my worth was shrinking. To my surprise, the house responded to my attention. Small changes made a difference. Meals planned instead of improvised, laundry handled before it became a mountain, paperwork filed instead of piled. Claire came home calmer when she didn't have to carry the mental load of domestic life on top of her work. She started sleeping better. We argued less. That should have been enough to make me feel proud. Instead, I felt a new kind of discomfort. The sense that I was good at something I'd been taught to dismiss. A month into our new arrangement, Claire said something that started as an offhand comment and ended up changing the trajectory of my life. She had a corporate event coming up. Not a party exactly, but a networking function with executives and clients. She would be introducing herself to people who could shape her future. She needed me there, she said. Not as a decoration but as support. It helps, she explained. It signals stability. It makes people see me as established. I nodded, already thinking about the logistics. I'd wear my best suit, I'd make polite conversation, I'd stand at her side and be the dependable husband. That was easy enough. Then she looked at me for a moment and said, "Your suit is fine, but you look uncomfortable in it lately. You've been carrying tension in your shoulders. You're not taking care of yourself. If you're going with me, I want you to feel put together." I laughed, trying to keep it light. "You want me to moisturize. I want you to be intentional," she said. "If I'm going to lead, you're going to be part of how we present ourselves. That's not about pretending. It's about choosing." The next day she came home with a small bag and set it on the counter. Inside were basic grooming things. A face wash, a moisturizer, a simple concealer. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical. Just tools. "Try them," she said. "See how it feels." I felt my old reflexes flaring. The childhood rule that said this was the wrong side of the line. But Claire's demeanor wasn't teasing or daring. It was practical, almost clinical, the way she approached anything that might improve performance. She wasn't asking me to become someone else. She was asking me to refine what was already there. That evening I stood in the bathroom and applied moisturizer with a carefulness that surprised me. When I dabbed the concealer under my eyes, I expected to feel ridiculous. Instead I felt neat. As if I had cleaned up not just my face, but the story I wore on it. I looked less like a man who had been punched by circumstance, and more like someone who had choices. At the event I did what I always did. Smiled, shook hands, listened. But I noticed something new. Claire's confidence seemed to expand when she sensed me steady beside her. She spoke with more ease. She laughed without scanning the room for approval. When she introduced me, her hand rested lightly on my arm and she said, "This is my partner. Not my husband like a label, but partner like a role we had chosen. On the drive home she said, "You were good." "I just stood there," I said, half joking. "You held yourself differently," she replied. "That matters." A week later she brought up the idea again, but more directly. "There are moments," she said, "when the social dynamic of those rooms is strange. It's not fair, but it's true. Men in those spaces often talk past women. They treat me like an exception or a novelty. But when I show up with a spouse who clearly supports me, it changes the way they approach me. It shouldn't, but it does." I understood the strategy. Then she added, "And it might help if we experiment with the way you show up. Something that signals softness, not weakness. Softness." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Claire hesitated, which was rare for her. "I mean, what if you didn't show up as the traditional husband? What if you showed up as my wife?" The word hit me like cold water. My mind immediately supplied images I didn't want. Mockery, whispers, the kind of laughter that pretends to be harmless but cuts deep. I felt defensive. "Why would we do that?" "Because it might work," she said calmly. "And because I've watched you for years. You've always been drawn to elegance. To the details you pretend not to notice. You notice fabrics. You notice how people move. You notice what makes a room feel safe. That's not a flaw. That's a strength. But you've been hiding it behind this rigid idea of what you're allowed to be." I wanted to deny it. I wanted to say she was reading too much into normal preferences. But she was right, and the worst part was that I had known it for a long time. The idea frightened me precisely because it wasn't foreign. It was familiar. I told her no at first. Not angrily but firmly. "I can support you without that." She nodded and didn't push. But the idea stayed with me, buzzing at the edge of my thoughts. I found myself noticing women's clothing in a way that wasn't about attraction. It was about shape, texture, intention. I thought about how women were allowed a wider range of expression. How they could be gentle and powerful, decorated and serious. I realized I had always envied that range without admitting it. A few months later Claire's career took another step forward. More travel, more events, more visibility. I became, by necessity, the household manager in a deeper way. I learned to cook better. I learned to plan. I learned to anticipate her needs without being asked. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, the power dynamic between us shifted. Claire wasn't just earning more. She was leading more. I wasn't just doing chores. I was supporting her leadership. One evening, after a particularly stressful week for her, she came home and found me folding laundry while listening to a podcast about stress management. I looked up and said, "How was your day?" And the question was genuine, not performative. I saw her face soften. She sat on the couch and let out a long breath. "I don't think I could do this without you," she said. The words landed differently than praise for my old job performance ever had. This wasn't about me achieving something impressive. This was about me being present. I felt proud in a quiet way. Then, unexpectedly, I felt grief. Grief for how long I had believed that supporting someone else was lesser. That night, Claire brought the earlier conversation back, but with a different tone. "I'm not asking you to do something you hate," she said. "I'm asking you to consider whether you hate it, or whether you're afraid of what it means." I didn't answer immediately. I thought about the little boy in my aunt's closet. I thought about the years of turning away from myself. I thought about how I'd been performing a role so hard that I couldn't tell where it ended, and I began. "I don't want it to be a joke," I said finally. "I don't want it to be a stunt." "It won't be," Claire said. "If we do it with respect. It's not about humiliation. It's not about fantasy. It's about exploring a part of you that you've treated like it doesn't deserve daylight." We agreed on rules which might sound unromantic but actually made it feel safe. We would keep it non-sexual. We would treat it as identity exploration and social presentation, not as entertainment. We would stop if it harmed my mental health or her reputation. We would be honest with each other about discomfort. We would move slowly. The first step wasn't a dress. It wasn't a dramatic makeover. It was posture. Claire stood behind me in the living room and said, "Relax your shoulders. Let your hands be softer." She showed me how she walked. Balanced, intentional, not apologizing for taking up space. She had me practice in front of the mirror, not to mimic her but to find my own version of grace. At first I felt absurd, like an actor in a play I hadn't auditioned for. But then something surprising happened. The more I practiced, the more my body stopped fighting. I realized I had been carrying a clenched masculinity in my muscles, a constant readiness to prove I wasn't fragile. When I let that go, my breathing changed. My face changed. I looked calmer. Then we moved to clothes, but carefully. Claire chose simple, understated items. A neutral blouse, tailored pants that weren't obviously feminine unless you knew what you were looking for, shoes with a clean line. She explained everything like she was teaching a skill. This fabric falls differently. This cut changes how you move. This color makes your skin look less tired. I remember holding the blouse in my hands and feeling my heart race. Not excitement, fear. Fear that putting it on would reveal something irreversible. I stepped into the bathroom and closed the door, as if I needed privacy from the version of myself who might judge me. When I put it on and looked in the mirror, I didn't see a caricature. I saw myself but softened, like someone had adjusted the lighting. The blouse didn't erase me. It made me visible in a new way. My first emotion wasn't joy. It was sadness. Because I realized how long I had denied myself any permission to be gentle. I walked out and Claire looked up. She didn't laugh. She didn't clap. She simply nodded and said, "That suits you." That was when the tension became real. Because the more natural it felt, the more terrifying it became. If it felt natural, then it wasn't just a costume. It was connected to something true. And if it was true, then my life would have to make room for it. The first time we went out together with me presenting more femininely, it wasn't to a corporate event. It was to a quiet restaurant in a neighboring town where we were unlikely to run into anyone we knew. Claire insisted on that step. "We're not doing this for shock," she said. "We're doing this to see how it feels in the real world." I remember walking from the car to the entrance and feeling every nerve in my body light up. I was hyper-aware of my hands, my voice, my height, my shoulders. I expected people to stare, to point, to laugh. Some glanced at me, then looked away. A waiter smiled and said, "Good evening," as if we were any other couple. We sat, we ordered, we ate. The world did not end. But I did feel something shift. Not in the room, in me. I realized that most of my fear was not about what people would do to me. It was about what I believed I deserved. If I believed I was doing something shameful, then any glance would feel like a verdict. If I believed I was doing something human, then a glance was just a glance. On the drive home, Claire said, "How was it?" I thought for a long time before answering. "It was harder and easier than I expected." She nodded. "That's usually the truth." The next months were not a smooth upward journey. They were messy. Sometimes I felt calm and confident. Other times I felt like I was betraying everyone who had ever loved me, even though no one had asked me to be a certain way. I would wake up in the middle of the night with my mind replaying childhood warnings and imagined headlines. I would swing between feeling liberated and feeling foolish. Claire stayed steady. She encouraged me to journal. She encouraged me to talk to a therapist, not because she thought I was broken but because she understood that identity work is heavy. I started therapy with someone who didn't treat crossdressing as a punchline or a pathology. She asked questions that were both gentle and sharp. What did femininity represent to me? Safety, beauty, permission. What did masculinity represent? Obligation, control, pride. What did I fear losing? What did I hope to gain? I realized that my relationship with gender expression had been shaped by two forces: the external rules of society and the internal pressure of perfectionism. I had grown up believing that being loved required being legible. If people couldn't easily categorize you, they might not know how to treat you. And if they didn't know how to treat you, they might treat you poorly. So I tried to be easy to read. I tried to be the kind of man no one would question. And in doing so, I had questioned myself constantly. The corporate events returned, and eventually we faced the question we'd been avoiding. Would I accompany Claire as her wife in those spaces? We didn't leap. We planned. We considered the risks to her career. We considered my mental health. We thought about safety. Claire's world was not cruel, but it was conservative in the way many corporate cultures are. Polite on the surface, judgmental in quiet corners. There were power dynamics. There were reputations. There were people who smiled while taking notes in their minds. We decided on a middle path at first. I would present in a refined, androgynous way. Enough softness to shift the dynamic, not so much that it would become the only story in the room. Claire coached me in social strategy. How to deflect invasive questions, how to redirect conversation to her work, how to be warm without becoming entertainment. At the first event like that, I felt like my skin was too thin. Claire introduced me to a senior executive and said, "This is my spouse." The executive looked me up and down for half a second longer than necessary, then said, "Nice to meet you." His tone was neutral, but his eyes carried a question he didn't ask. A younger colleague, however, smiled brightly and said, "I love your style." It was a small kindness, but it mattered. It reminded me that people are not a monolith. Some are cruel. Some are curious. Some are kind. Most are busy thinking about themselves. As the night progressed, I noticed something else. Claire's authority sharpened. People listened to her more. They interrupted less. It wasn't because I had become more feminine, exactly. It was because the social script had changed. When she stood next to a spouse who was clearly not competing with her, not trying to reclaim the spotlight, it made her leadership feel unchallenged. The room adjusted, as rooms do, to cues. On the way home, Claire said quietly, "Did you notice how Mark stopped talking over me?" I had. And I felt a complicated mix of satisfaction and anger. Satisfaction that it helped, anger that it was necessary. Over time we became bolder, not in spectacle but in honesty. At certain events with the right crowd, I presented more clearly as her wife. A simple dress with clean lines, a low heel, hair styled neatly, makeup subtle enough to read as polish rather than performance. Claire's instruction remained consistent. Elegance, not exaggeration. Respect, not provocation. The first time she said in public, "This is my wife," my heart stuttered. The word wife had always seemed like something that belonged to women in a narrow, traditional sense. Hearing it attached to me felt like stepping into a new room of the mind. It wasn't that I suddenly believed I was literally a woman. It was that I allowed myself to inhabit a role that carried softness and support without shame. And that's when I had to confront something deeper. Why did softness feel like surrender? And why did surrender feel like failure? Claire and I talked about submission, but not as a sexual dynamic. More as a life orientation. She had always been a leader. I had always been a supporter, but I had dressed that support in masculine language. Provider, protector, partner. Now the support was visible in a different way. And that visibility forced me to examine the pride I had hidden inside my masculinity. I had believed I was equal because my contributions were financially legible. When they weren't, I had to find a different kind of equality. One rooted in mutual respect, not mirrored roles. The tension wasn't only internal. It reached into our friendships and families. First we told no one. Not because we were ashamed, but because we wanted privacy while we learned. But privacy has limits when your life changes. A friend asked why I was always free lately. A relative made a comment about Claire wearing the pants. Each remark was small, but together they created pressure. The first time someone saw me by accident was a neighbor. I was stepping out to pick up a package, wearing a cardigan and soft makeup because Claire and I were about to go out. I saw her at the end of the walkway. She froze, eyes widening. I felt my stomach drop. She didn't say anything cruel. She just said, "Oh, hi," with the awkwardness of someone who has stumbled into a private room. I said hello and tried to sound normal. She smiled too hard and walked away. Later that night I sat on the couch, shaking with delayed adrenaline, and told Claire. It happened. Someone saw. Claire sat beside me and said, "And you survived." I wanted to laugh, but I couldn't. I felt the old shame rising like a tide. Claire held my hand and said, "We can't build our life around other people's confusion." That sentence became a kind of anchor. Not a weapon against society, not a slogan, but a reminder that our decisions had to be made from the inside out. We eventually told a small circle of friends. We chose carefully. People with emotional maturity, people who had shown kindness in other contexts. We explained it the way it was. A shift in roles after I lost my job, a deeper exploration of identity, a non-sexual process of learning what expressions felt honest. We didn't ask for applause. We asked for respect. The responses were mixed, and that was its own education. One friend said, "I don't really get it, but I love you both. Tell me what you need." That was the best kind of support. Not immediate understanding, but willingness. Another friend tried to be supportive and ended up being invasive. She asked if I was actually trans, if I planned to fully transition, if Claire was into it. Her questions were not malicious, but they reduced my experience to categories that felt too narrow. I learned to set boundaries. "I'm still figuring it out," I would say. "And I'm not discussing anything sexual. This is about identity and partnership." A third friend went quiet and drifted away. That loss hurt more than I expected. It forced me to grieve not just a friendship, but the illusion that being good and loyal guarantees being accepted. My family was the hardest. I delayed telling them for a long time. Part of me still wanted to be the son who didn't complicate things. But hiding also has a cost. Every family visit required wardrobe calculations, emotional rehearsals, lies of omission. When I finally told my mother, I chose a calm afternoon. I didn't dress up or down. I simply said, "There's something important about my life I want you to know." I explained slowly, emphasizing that Claire and I were solid, that I was healthy, that I was not being coerced, that this was not a crisis but an evolution. My mother cried. Not because she hated me but because she was scared. "People can be cruel," she said. "I don't want you hurt." "I don't either," I told her. "But hiding hurts too." She asked if I was ashamed. Said yes and no. I said I was learning. I said I wanted to live with integrity. My father's reaction, when he eventually learned, was anger at first. He said things like, "Why would you do that? And what does that make you?" I could hear the fear underneath, but it came out as judgment. For the first time in my life, I didn't try to fix his feelings. I said, "It makes me me. I'm not asking you to understand everything. I'm asking you not to disrespect me." That conversation didn't resolve neatly. It left bruises. For a while my father and I spoke less. I felt the old childhood urge to apologize for existing. Therapy helped me resist it. Claire helped too, not by fighting my battles but by reminding me that my identity was not a debate to be won. Around this time I also faced a quieter truth. I was depressed. Not all the time, not in a dramatic way. But there were days when getting out of bed felt like climbing. There were moments when I would look in the mirror, whether dressed traditionally or not, and feel like I was watching someone else's life. The therapist helped me see that this wasn't only about gender expression. It was about loss of status, loss of certainty, loss of the old story. Crossdressing didn't cause my depression. It simply removed one of the masks I'd used to cover it. I began building healthier coping strategies. Regular exercise, not as punishment but as grounding. Meditation, which I used to dismiss until I realized it was simply practice at returning to the present. Community, carefully chosen. I found online spaces focused on non-sexual crossdressing and gender expression where people talked about work, family, anxiety, safety, and dignity. It helped to see others treating this as a human variation rather than a secret indulgence. The more I stabilized internally, the more I could reflect on what was really happening between Claire and me. Our role swap had started as practical, but it had evolved into something deeper. A redefinition of leadership and support in our marriage. Claire's leadership was not domination. It was responsibility. She carried risk. She made decisions under pressure. She was accountable. My support was not servitude. It was competence. It was emotional labor. It was the creation of a home that functioned as a foundation rather than a burden. When I accompanied her as her wife, I wasn't shrinking. I was choosing a form of strength that my upbringing had taught me to deny. Still, there were ethical questions. Were we manipulating social perceptions? Were we using gender expectations to influence people? Was that fair? The therapist asked me, "Are you lying about who you are, or are you revealing something true in a form that people can finally perceive?" That question stayed with me. The truth was, I wasn't deceiving anyone about being a different person. I was changing my presentation. People do that all the time. Men wear suits to look competent. Women wear certain styles to be taken seriously. Everyone codes themselves for environments. The difference was that my coding challenged a norm rather than reinforcing it. That made it visible, and visibility invites judgment. I began to think of identity not as a single label but as a landscape. Some parts are fixed, some parts change with time, some parts only emerge when circumstances allow. Losing my job had cracked open a space where I could explore. Claire's ambition had provided a new structure. And my willingness to step into a supportive, elegant role had revealed a part of me that had always existed but had been buried under fear. As the years passed, the novelty wore off. Not in the sense of losing meaning, but in the sense of becoming ordinary. I learned what styles felt like me and what felt like costume. I learned which environments were safe and which were not worth the risk. I learned how to correct someone politely when they made assumptions. I learned to accept that some people would never understand, and that my job was not to convince them at the cost of my peace. Claire's career flourished. She became, in her company, a person whose name carried weight. She mentored younger employees, especially women, and she advocated for policies that made work more humane. Watching her lead taught me a different kind of masculinity too. A masculinity that wasn't threatened by a woman's success, that didn't need to dominate to feel real. And I changed as well. I began volunteering with a local organization that supported families facing job loss and mental health challenges. I found that my experience, both the unemployment and the identity exploration, made me more empathetic. When a man sat across from me and said he felt useless because he couldn't provide, I didn't offer him empty reassurance. I told him the truth. That the grief is real, that the shame can be intense, that you can rebuild worth on something sturdier than a paycheck. I also told him that being cared for is not a moral failure. Sometimes I was asked directly about my presentation, and I learned how to speak about it without defensiveness. "I'm exploring," I would say. "It helps me feel whole. It's not about sex. It's not about a performance. It's about allowing myself to be more than one narrow definition." I saw people relax when they realized I wasn't trying to shock them. I was trying to live. There were still hard moments. A rude comment in public. A family gathering where someone's eyes lingered too long, searching for a punchline. An event where I chose not to attend because the risk felt too high. Those moments didn't disappear, but my relationship to them changed. I stopped interpreting every discomfort as proof that I shouldn't exist. I started interpreting it as information. About the environment, about the person, about what boundaries I needed. One of the most meaningful turning points happened quietly at home, not in public. Claire came home late one night after a difficult day. She looked tired in a way I hadn't seen in years. She sat at the kitchen table and said, "I don't know if I can keep doing this pace." My instinct was to jump into problem solving. But I had learned that leadership sometimes needs witnessing more than fixing. I made tea, sat across from her, and listened. She talked about pressure, about being the example, about the loneliness of being the person everyone expects to be strong. When she finished, I said, "You don't have to carry it alone." She looked at me and said, "Neither do you." In that moment I understood that our role swap had never been about one of us winning and the other losing. It was about us rebalancing. Claire's leadership had given me permission to soften. My softness had given her permission to rest. We had built a partnership that didn't require either of us to fit a stereotype. I also came to understand something important about identity exploration. It doesn't always lead to a dramatic conclusion. It doesn't always end with a new label or a public announcement. For some people it does. For others like me, the outcome was integration rather than transformation. I did not wake up one day and declare a definitive answer. I simply kept living and paying attention. I learned which expressions brought peace. I learned which were motivated by fear. I learned to take responsibility for my choices, to be honest with Claire, to respect the social contexts we entered without shrinking myself into invisibility. If there is a lesson I would offer to anyone listening, it's that self-respect is not something you earn by being perfect. It's something you practice by telling the truth gently, first to yourself and then to others. And truth doesn't have to be loud to be real. I used to think dignity meant never being seen uncertain. Now I think dignity means allowing yourself to be complex without turning that complexity into chaos. It means making choices carefully. It means seeking help when you need it. It means refusing to let shame be the loudest voice in the room. I also learned empathy in a way I didn't expect. When you step outside a norm even a little, you start noticing how often other people are trapped by different norms. The woman who feels she has to be agreeable to be safe. The man who feels he can't cry without losing status. The teenager who is terrified that one honest sentence will cost them their family. The quiet person who is always performing fine. My experience didn't make me an expert on everyone's identity, but it did make me more careful with my assumptions. Made me kinder. And in the simplest, most personal sense, I learned to look in the mirror, whether I was in jeans and a t-shirt or in a dress and subtle makeup, and recognize the same person. Not a contradiction. Not a joke. Not a problem to solve. Just a human being trying to live with integrity. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.